Okay, welcome. Kyle, you ready to get going? All right, great. Welcome everyone to our webinar on the Accelerated Mobility Playbook and the Technical Assistance Grant that we're offering. My name is Zoe Kircos. I am one of 3 partners at CityThread. We're a national nonprofit consulting firm, and we have worked for many years with cities and their community partners to help them speed the implementation of their mobility infrastructure. So we're excited to offer a new grant to help us bring that opportunity to more cities. I will share a little bit about myself. I have a long history in managing programs and national partnerships, national, local, regional partnerships, and fundraising. I led work around mobility, infrastructure, youth bicycling, equity and shared micromobility, and also have administered grant programs for many years, as well as being a fundraiser in that space as well. And I will just add that I am joining you here from Boulder, Colorado, where I've lived for 30 years, and but I'm originally from Detroit, Michigan, and still go back there frequently. And I'll pause there so my partner, Kyle Wagenschutz, can introduce himself as well.
Great. Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are attending from. I'm Kyle Wagenschutz. On our team, I'm the former city employee and former bureaucrat of the group. I've been working in mobility and transportation related work for the last 15 years, and also coming to you today from Colorado.
Thanks, Kyle. And then I'll add that we have a third partner, Sarah Studdard, whose photo you can see on the screen, but Sarah is not joining us in front of the screen, on screen for you today. You just get me and Kyle, but we'll try to bear up with in her absence. So, as we were thinking about how to launch this webinar, we thought about, is there a way to actually play Are You Stuck Bingo? I kind of, thought about maybe we could send some bingo cards out to all the registrants ahead of the webinar. Maybe we could have a way in the chat where you could like vote for your top issue and we could put a little dot on that. But then I decided that instead we would just have sort of this representational bingo card for all the things that we hear people say to us, that others are saying to them for the reasons why cities cannot move on delivering the kind of infrastructure that their community actually wants and needs. So, and I'm guessing if you're joining us here today, you're working in this space, and many, if not most, if not all of these phrases and statements will sound really familiar to you. I will say that we spent about the first 3 months of last year traveling to a group of cities that we were working with on the Accelerated Mobility Playbook. And these are kind of collectively the things that they told us that they were hearing on why they could not move or could not move fast enough to deliver the projects that we know people want. And I thought of this bingo card primarily because when we were talking with cities in particular and they were listing their barriers, and I'm not saying that these aren't real, these are all totally real, they are totally what we hear. They're our lived experience. But when we talked to city folks in particular, we knew that we hadn't heard all the barriers until they said, oh, and we don't have enough money. So not having enough money is the free space on the bingo card because nobody has enough money to deliver these kinds of projects, or nobody thinks they do. And they think of that as their number one barrier. We will actually dispel that myth. We don't think that money is the biggest barrier, but that's not to say that it isn't real, and it isn't what most cities are dealing with. So we sort of share this to say, we hear you, we see you, we feel that, we get it, and we can help. With that, I'll pass it over to my partner, Kyle.
Thanks, Zoe. And I would say that for the 3 of us at CityThread, this is our bingo card in some ways, right? Like we created this because of our own work, both helping cities try to advance mobility projects, and also with the work that we personally have done, historically within cities of trying to advance mobility projects. And one of the reasons that we started CityThread was because we spent a long time trying to change the way that our streets work, thinking about planning for, trying to implement, changes that'll make our streets safer for people walking or bicycling, trying to get more people to use public transit to make it more efficient and reliable. Just thinking whatever sort of like, direction you're coming at in terms of, thinking about mobility and the changes that you'd like to make. We've been there. We've also remarked and experienced, that the pace of change to our streets is glacial, right? There are projects that take 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. You've probably got plans on the shelf for projects that you'll never maybe ever even start or ever actually get to. And we a few years ago got together and said, there's got to be a way to sort of like overcome this. We're hearing a lot of the same things, the same bingo card in every city. And there's got to be a way to overcome that. And so I want to tell a little story about a couple of cities that we worked with where we sort of began to develop the Accelerated Mobility Playbook and sort of what that meant to them. And I want to tell a story of two very different cities, New Orleans and Austin, who came to us in 2018 from very different places. The city of New Orleans has one of the highest bicycle mode shares in the entire country, but very little infrastructure was on the ground. There were a rising number of crashes involving people walking and bicycling across the street. And they came to us and they said, we want to change that. We, under Mayor Cantrell, we want to invest in our neighborhoods. We want to invest in people, but we don't have a plan today. We're not really sure how we're going to pay for it. We've not done a good job of this historically of making investments in our public spaces, and no one likes us, right? No one really trusts that we're going to be delivering on the promise of a different future. The city of Austin came to us at the same exact time, and they said, hey, we just passed this bond to build all these bicycle lanes and sidewalks and trails, but we're having a really hard time actually getting through the public process of implementation. They said, we're going to get there, but it's going to take us a really long time. We would like to deliver projects faster, but we're running into complications with different political agendas. We're running into complications with our media, who sort of lambaste us every single time that we get out and attempt to do a project. And so these two cities were feeling stuck. They had their own bingo cards. They marked the different spaces on their card. And they came to CityThread, to our team, and asked us, can you help us get unstuck? Can you help us reach this new transportation future that we've spent time planning with in the community, and this vision that we actually have? And how can we do that much faster? Next slide, Zoe. And so over the course of a couple of years, the CityThread team developed what we're calling today the Accelerated Mobility Playbook. And we're going to call it AMP because it's easier to say than the whole word, and because all of us working in cities love acronyms. And the AMP is was really our systematic approach to understanding and overcoming the reasons that cities get stuck. And taking a look at, sort of three primary factors of why cities are actually, not able to deliver the projects they want to deliver, that they need to deliver in a timely manner with the urgency that they want to actually sort of have them happen. And part of this challenge with AMP, sort of with moving within cities, is actually the need to break the cycle of project delivery process that already exists in our city, right? It's a tale as old as time. We have a project, it's in our plan, we go out for community engagement, we do a design, city council weighs in, people get upset, we do more public engagement, we change the design, we do this over and over and over again over the course of a couple of years until we get to the end of the process. The design that we actually agree on and implement is radically different than where we started on day one. No one's really happy because over the course of that process, we've had to compromise on safety. We've had to compromise on the design work itself in a way that sort of like makes it okay for people who want to walk or bike. It makes it okay for people who want to drive. Our elected leaders sort of get to a place where they just want the public dialogue to stop around this. And at the end of it, we say, okay, let's go do all that all over again on the next project. And so the AMP is a way of sort of rethinking the ways in which our civic, our municipal leaders interact with community partners, changing the focus around sort of like, what can we get done, to what would we like to get done, and plotting a path forward for that. It leans really heavily on community engagement, the direct partnership between people working in our communities, our nonprofit organizations, our businesses, our passionate residents who want to be involved in this work. and facilitating a direct partnership with our city leaders who are responsible for delivering projects, for meeting mandates and bureaucratic processes, all the restrictions that we know that exist within cities, and about taking these two sort of different but motivated groups of individuals and bringing them together around a central strategy. Next slide, Zoe. And what we found in New Orleans, in Austin, and in other cities is that this rethinking the ways in which we talk about our work, reframing who benefits from it, right? Are we building a bike lane solely for the benefit of bicyclists? What do people who drive cars get out of that? What do people who walk get out of that? Rethinking the ways we think about, in terms of describing why we're actually doing this work is a central strategy for overcoming these obstacles. Thinking about internally at our cities and our municipalities, how do we streamline community engagement? How do we streamline project delivery processes that become more predictable over time, that become more repetitious over time? Also thinking about the ways in which all of our local nonprofits, our advocacy groups, our business owners, and our residents, giving them a central strategy to organize around so that our municipal leaders aren't hearing similar but very different things from lots of different people. How do we unify the voice of support within our city? And frankly, how do we identify people who are not participating in public process today, but who want to see this work actually happen? How do we identify them and then give them a pathway to be really effective in terms of showing up and participating in ways that's more meaningful, than the small group of people who are always going to show up and who are always going to oppose the work that happens? And so this is not about coming in. The AMP is not a process for looking through all of your transportation plans and critiquing them, saying this is good, this is bad. The AMP is not about reshifting and rethinking about local priorities. It's about taking the ambition that you have locally about what you want to achieve and plotting a path forward to that, so that if you want to move faster, figuring out a way for how you move faster. If you want to sort of be more ambitious, it's about plotting a pathway for it to be more ambitious. If it's about just making the simple job of project delivery easier, right? If it's just about having like a positive experience at a public meeting, let's figure out a way to actually do that. And so the AMP looks both not at sort of like what we can create and head towards. It looks at what you already have, and then plots a customized strategy to get to that actual place. And here's a couple of examples from our previous cities that were stuck. The city of New Orleans, I mentioned earlier, was in a place where they didn't even have a plan. And one of the main obstacles that we found when we began working there, particularly when we began doing focus groups and some surveys in neighborhoods within New Orleans, is that residents and business owners just didn't believe that the city could actually change the way the streets worked, right? Just sort of this essential sense of disbelief that this future vision could actually be enacted by government, that they have millions of examples of the reasons in which government had failed to deliver on past promises. You looked out onto the streets and you saw years and decades of disinvestment. And so for a lot of people that we were engaging in New Orleans, the work there really sort of centered around how do we rethink about this process as a way of both completely redeveloping the community engagement practice of the city, which was pretty lean. And then also, how do we move to construction quickly in a way that would sort of stoke that belief, right? How do we move from a planning process today into a construction process tomorrow? And that's sort of like a little bit of hyperbole, but one of the problems that we often have in communities is that we do a plan, and then in a few years, we start enacting some pieces of the plan, and before we know it, we're updating the plan. And we think like, what did we actually get accomplished from the last version of this? And so in New Orleans, we really helped the city design a process where they could go from community engagement around a planning exercise, like what kind of network would you like to see in your neighborhood? How do we center people who are riding bicycles, people who are walking, and transit as priorities within that plan? And how do you move to construction as quickly as humanly possible so that we can overcome this disbelief that the government's actually going to be sort of doing this work? And so in the course of 24 months, the city of New Orleans developed a citywide bicycle mobility plan and delivered 27 miles of new of new bicycle lanes, primarily protected bicycle lanes in one neighborhood of the city. And one of the things that we were really glad to sort of learn and sort of became a central focus of our campaign is that 3/4 of the people living in New Orleans wanted to see this happen. That's a central strategy of the AMP itself, is identifying, again, that those people who are supportive of this work, who aren't waking up every day thinking, I need to email the mayor and let them know that I'm really grateful for these new bicycle lanes, or I'm grateful for the sidewalks that got fixed, and giving them a pathway to actually do that, incentivizing them to actually be a part of that particular process. And so that's just one example of the way in which the AMP worked in New Orleans to get them moving from, not much progress, but building some momentum so they could think about community engagement radically differently and also see the results happen really fast. Next slide, Zoe. I mentioned the city of Austin is like a sort of the complete opposite from New Orleans in terms of, like, when they came to us, they had passed a multi-million-dollar bond that provided them all the funding, all the staffing capacity they needed internally at the city to actually get infrastructure built on the ground. But they were having a really hard time of it. And so it's like, if you're thinking about the bingo card, right, the free space, not enough money, Austin sort of crossed that off the list, but they were still stuck. They were moving at a pace, so they were going to build their plan in a couple of decades. And they said, wow, we have all of these competing priorities as a city. We have a climate change mandate to reduce emissions across the city. We have really serious traffic congestion that we need to address. We've got some real bottlenecks and real missing gaps in our bicycle network that prevent people from getting safely from one part of town to the other. And so the challenge here wasn't so much, in terms of redefining the planning process for the city. It wasn't really about sort of like, rethinking community engagement in real ways. In some ways different than New Orleans, Austin had answered some of those questions, but the reasons they were stuck looked very different. They were getting a lot of mixed messages from elected officials, city council, city manager, the mayor. All of those exist in Austin, and they all have competing priorities. They were really sort of failing to get people who supported this work to show up and attend public hearings, public meetings, design charrettes. That they were getting this usual group of people who sort of were unhappy with general change in Austin, who came to every single meeting, and they said, we know that there's supporters out there, they're just not showing up to be a part of this process, and it's slowing down our workflow. It causes questions from our elected officials to make sure we're doing the right thing, and so we're constantly being second guessed at every sort of step of the turn. And they told us, we're making positive momentum, it's just going really, really slow. And so what the AMP does in New Orleans, in Austin, it looked very different than New Orleans. It was really around, again, identifying that popular support, centering message, paid communications, working directly with media outlets to reframe stories. We worked with a project manager in Austin who every single week made a round of calls to every single reporter that was reporting on transportation issues in Austin, and he pitched them a new story. And just the simple act of sort of actively being engaged in a media conversation began to produce new stories over time. And it got to a point where the city of Austin began to really, really expedite their project delivery. They were having fewer public meetings because the public meetings they were having were so successful in terms of having people support show up that they didn't have to go through all of these revisions over time. And so they actually shortened their project delivery process by several months simply by not having to go through the reiterations and renegotiations over what was happening on the streets, removing or parking or lanes. And that led them to a place where they began to sort of fill in these network gaps. But then suddenly the narrative began to change around the city, is that, we don't have a disconnected bicycle lane to nowhere. We don't have this bicycle lane that looks amazing, but then drops you off at a highway. Suddenly we have a bicycle network, and I can get from this part of town to another part of town really easily, and it's seamless. And, in the case of Austin, because they had the money, it looks actually really good. They went back to voters at the end of our time of working with them and asked them for some more money. And you see in the headline here, the voters overwhelmingly supported a new set of mobility funds totaling more than $1 billion. And so Austin's now on pace to finish their planned all ages and abilities bicycle network in the next few years. And I've been working with cities for a long time, and I've never known a city to be able to say that I've finished our plan. I don't even know what a city does at a point when they actually complete a plan. We've only ever done updates to unfinished plans. And so I'm really excited about the prospects in Austin, but just to sort of say, and I'll turn it back over to you, Zoe, that where these cities come from and the reasons they're stuck are very, very different. But the AMP is a way of customizing a strategy to sort of say, like, why are you stuck? Where do you want to go? And how can we help you move there?
Thanks, Kyle. So I am just kind of imagining the questions bubbling up in your head, and we're still a few minutes out from our Q&A, but wondering if your city is ripe and right. So, we get questions frequently of like, my city is really small, or we're a suburb, or we're a rural community, or we have millions of residents like Austin. Does this work in any of those? We don't have a bike ped plan, or we have one, but it's 10 years old, or we have an RFP out to create a new one, but we're not going to have that done for another year. Some folks say, we don't have a bike advocacy organization, or we have 7 of them and none of them talk to each other. We have a mayor that's supportive, but the city council isn't, or the majority on council is on board, but the city manager is kind of skittish, or staff is really progressive, but the department head is really old school. And so I'll just say we've worked in cities of all sizes. We've worked in communities that are like suburbs, but really kind of rural, and small cities that are rather suburban. We've worked in a lot of mid-sized cities, and also some really big ones like Austin, as Kyle described. And I'd also add that of the 10 cities that we worked in last year, only about half of them actually had a bike plan that was informing what they were doing, the projects that they were doing, and how they were prioritizing them. And for leadership, I mean, it's super helpful if you have a mayor or a city council that's wholly on board, but we've also worked in places where that wasn't the case, and it made it work. So all this to say, this assessment is really to tell you where you are with all the opportunities and the barriers and the challenges that are in front of you. And then it gives you a playbook, as Kyle described, for what you need to do. So no matter what your particular scenario is, it can work where you are. So how do I sign up? Good news. The grant round we just opened is accepting applications, and we'll select 4 cities as part of our next cohort. I'm going to go through a little bit of the logistics and nuts and bolts of the program. So we always, we'll probably select 4 cities. We always start with an in-person site visit where we come out, we meet folks in person. We hopefully start some interviews of usually groups of people. And then we do, after we return home, do more stakeholder interviews. So we want to get a really representational sampling. So we talk to folks in the community, community-based organizations, advocacy groups. We talk to a lot of city staff. We talk to elected leaders. We also like to talk to anchor institutions and philanthropic leaders. We review all the plans, the processes, the goals, the budgets. We watch videos of hearings and of city council meetings. That's super exciting stuff. We wouldn't miss it for the world. It gives us a really good insight into what's happening on the ground in a city. We doom scroll the social media accounts of the city, of community groups. We look at how the city is communicating to residents and how residents are filtering information back up to their elected leaders. And then we come back with that set of deliverables you see on the right. So we really, provide an assessment of this is what's going on. Here's what's going well. Here's what's going wrong. And we pair that with an action plan that gives some specific tactics, strategies, and goals that we think is doable for that community. And then we end with an in-person convening that'll take place in the fall. We bring the 2 leads from each city together to help them do some peer networking, but mostly together figure out how they're going to move on to the next step, which is actually implementing kind of the plan that they put together. So here are the details. The deadline for this particular round is March 22nd. Call out a couple other things. Mostly, we want to make sure people are clear that we do require a partnership between a city department and a nonprofit actually, it doesn't have to be a nonprofit, a community-based organization. It could be a business, like a bid or a chamber. Often it's an advocacy organization, but sometimes it's another group. But we think it's really important to have both groups, both sides of that equation bought in to the process, because we really need those groups to be in collaboration and partnership for the work that we're doing ahead. It's not something that cities can do all by themselves, and community groups need the partnership of a city to actually change how their streets are operating. So we think it's really important to start that partnership with this process. The deliverables are listed there again. And I'll just say that the project timeline runs from about April through October. After this webinar, we will send out a follow-up email that has the link directly to the application materials and other FAQs and other information. And also, we are happy to have one-on-one calls with anyone there to, to discuss. I've already heard from a few cities that have some different nuances of how things are going to be working in their city or in their region. And so we're happy to have those conversations with anyone who's interested to talk through what your application might look like and the specifics of, what that might look like and how we can help you. I think that's it, and we're ready to go to Q&A, unless you have anything to add, Kyle.
No, nothing to add, but we've got some good questions in here, Zoe.
Cool.
So
Awesome.
maybe I'll throw one your way really quickly, and then there's a couple here that I can answer really directly. And just put your questions in the chat or the Q&A box, and we'll get to those live here. So Zoe, real quick question from Monica is, can a county apply to be a part of the program?
So that's probably a conversation that we should have in a little more detail. It often depends on, is the county in control of the roads that they're going to be looking at changing, or are they looking at maybe a collaboration between several municipalities that might be existing within that community, in that county? So that's probably a situation. I'm not saying no, and I'm not saying absolutely come forward and apply. I think that's something where we would need to have the conversation, because we'd want to make sure, if you're dealing with city roads, that we are involving those municipalities in the process. If it's just county, like a more rural county, then that's probably something that's a little more straightforward for us. So sorry to hedge on my first question, but I would say, Monica, set up a time or reach out, and we can reach out to you after this and chat through what that actually looks like in your community.
A couple more softballs, Zoe. Can you remind us about the local match requirement?
Oh, okay. Yeah, sorry, I didn't describe that one in too much detail. So the match is $15,000. That pays for about a third of the cost of our assessment. And that can come from a number of different places. It could be sometimes the city pays it, sometimes the community-based organization pays it, sometimes they split it, sometimes a local philanthropy comes in and covers that cost. We are happy to talk through what that is, but it is a cash match that helps us be able to bring this to more cities. And sorry, I skipped over that in my slide.
No,
Apologies.
it's okay. I've got one more for you, and then I'll take a couple, Zoe. Can the
Okay.
organizational partner be a state level advocacy group?
Oh, good one. I think so. Yeah, I think so. I don't see any reason not to. What we hear sometimes from those state groups is that they get accused of being sort of too focused sometimes on the largest metropolitan area in their state, and that can be sort of problematic for them. But as long as they are working as a partner to that local city entity, then I don't see any problem why the state focused organization can't be the community partner.
Yeah, I would add that some of our previous partners have been state level groups. Oftentimes they have like a separate team that works on local issues only, but we have worked directly with state level groups in the past in that regard. Cool. I'm going to take a couple. I'm going to go up from the bottom here. John asks, have you helped cities break through resistance from state DOTs on street designs? And this is a great bingo spot on Are You Feeling Stuck? Because it is, I feel like it could replace the free space at some point, Zoe, in terms of like my state DOT is really, really not good on these issues. The answer, John, to your question is yes and no. I mean, I think in some ways state DOTs are going to state DOT. And so, the change that's happening there is sort of a long, tedious sort of slog that just has to be done, but it doesn't really get faster or is affected by this, right? That bureaucracy exists. And really what we're talking about is how do we change the local dynamic, and where we have been helpful is a completely organizing sort of a local voice around what the needs of a local municipality actually are in a way that begins to resonate with the state DOT more and more. And so we have seen, particularly in the previous two examples that I used of both New Orleans and Austin, both two cities where some of their major roads that are a part of their plans, and are also their most dangerous roads, are also the roads that have the most right-of-way and need the most change and have the most opportunity. And so in both of those cases, really the work there was about beginning some real conversations with state DOTs, beginning to sort of bring them to the table in very different ways. And once they're there, having them hear from the elected officials as a unified voice, having them hear from local business owners as a unified voice, sort of solidifying the message that they're getting is that we need this, and we're not going to go away until we actually work through this problem. I'd be remiss to say that it made any of them move faster, but I would say that the conversation has dramatically changed in those places. And also, I think what's really important locally where the AMP has stepped in is sort of say, like, we know that these state DOT routes in our cities are a major problem that need to be worked through. But we can't slow down progress in other parts of the city waiting for that. In fact, we should all just take a sort of like a reality pill and say these might be some of the last things that actually get changed. But it shouldn't prevent us from tackling where we actually have the ability to do the work ourselves faster. And so, what I would say is that the AMP is a way of sort of bringing together all these disparate voices in the community in a way that can engage the state DOT in a radically different way. And, in a place like New Orleans, we're continuing to see progress happen on state routes that began several years ago, those conversations. And so I would say that they wouldn't have really sort of, made that level of progress had we not been using sort of the AMP framework previous to that. John also asked, just to sort of follow up on my example from New Orleans, that he's read in the news that some bicycle lanes have been removed in New Orleans. Were any of those part of the acceleration effort in Algiers? And I would say 100% yes. Utilizing the AMP is not a guaranteed strategy for that all of the results are going to be great. And if we had to sort of rethink and redo and re-advise some of the work that happened in Algiers, particularly in some of the early stages of that work in certain neighborhoods within Algiers, we probably would have re-strategized around that in some very, very different ways. And so, like, what I would say is, like, the AMP is a way of redefining community engagement. It's a way of rethinking project delivery process. It doesn't guarantee, end results are always going to be the right thing for the right neighborhood. And what I'm really proud of in New Orleans is, that the team at Public Works, recognized, the missteps that they made, sort of like, leading up to that implementation, and are proactively working, to improve that. And so what I'm really proud of is, like, internally, they now have the systems in place to be able to reflect on that. They have the ability and the systems in place to help them sort of think about this work as iteratively. And they know, what design features people just do not like and they won't do them anymore. And, all of this is about sort of iterative learning over years. And so I think there's lessons to be learned there. In some of the other cities that we worked in, Providence, for instance, Providence, Rhode Island, on day one, the mayor ripped out a bicycle lane, and we thought, like, holy smokes, like, what's going on here? Like, we just committed to working here, to helping the city, execute on this plan, and the very first bike lane that they put in, they rip out just a few months later. And really, there's an opportunity within the AMP for those kinds of experiences to exist, and the real important part there is learning about why we got into the situation, how do we avoid being in it into the future. And so for, like, a city like Providence, they went on after that and built 43 miles of new protected bicycle lanes all over the city. That one sort of ripping out some bicycle lanes wasn't an omen of the future. It was a learning opportunity, and the AMP adapted and helped the city move forward faster than it had planned to before.
Hey Kyle, I'll pitch one over to you
Thanks.
that has come in. This is an oldie but a goodie. We see this come up all the time. Tyler mentions that electeds are pretty on board, but having some issues with internal stakeholders like traffic engineers. Accepting that active transportation is a legitimate mode of transportation and then actively refusing to implement through level of service concerns, budget concerns, etc. Does the AMP help bridge the communication gap between those setting goals and those implementing projects? I think we've had this come up a couple times.
Yeah, I would say in some ways, Tyler, this is precisely what the AMP is designed to actually do. And so, 75% of the AMP strategy is a recognition that the people that should be working together and need to be working together to advance mobility projects are a little dysfunctional. In some cases, they're a lot dysfunctional. And really what the AMP is really centered around doing is solidifying those channels of communication and making sure that we're all on the same page. In order to do that, making sure that we have the resources that we all need, recognizing that our resource needs, regardless if we're talking about our elected officials, our internal city staff, and even our community stakeholders in local philanthropic organizations or other local nonprofit organizations, making sure that we're all in agreement on where we're actually going. And making sure that we have the tools and resources we need to actually get there. And so the AMP is really about redefining those methods of communication by centering it around sort of a shared vision and a shared goal for the future. And then, once that's in place, it's a critical step within the playbook itself. Then thinking about what are the public processes, then thinking about project delivery, then thinking about the planning. But communication, relationship building is really the key central strategy within the AMP itself. And it's a place where our team spends a considerable amount of time working to both uncover where breakdowns are actually happening and identifying solutions for moving things forward. I would my one caveat to this is like sometimes within cities there are people who just disagree with this work, right? Like even like the example from New Orleans, the example like we've never walked into a city where we've had like unanimous support from all the different stakeholders who are sitting at the table. But it's about creating enough consensus and enough momentum around an idea that we can begin to bring those people onto our team, get them involved in ways that make them feel really valuable, and helping them move forward. Zoe's smiling because we have a few cities right now where we have some internal traffic engineers that we're having these conversations with, and so it's an experience that we all have, and one in which can be overcome. It's one of the, I would say, relatively easier challenges to overcome in some cities compared to some of the other reasons that cities get stuck.
And just to add that we're not so much in the business of changing their minds as to just out maneuvering. Sort of, maybe that's a bad word. I would say getting the other voices to rise up in support of the type of changes that you're looking for, rather than shouting over instead of just telling them not to have the opinions that they have. Tyler also had kind of a follow-up question about whether during the AMP process they need to secure funds for implementation. We should be clear here that when we help cities think through their strategy and help identify a goal, we also identify what the next steps cost in terms of getting ready to move more quickly and to move, and then actually building things quickly. And the resources that we put out there that cities need are additional resources separate from implementation. So cities are kind of in charge of securing funds to actually build things. We don't bring those new funds to them, although we certainly let our partner cities know when grant funds are available, or where cities have been successful in applying for specific federal grant programs. SS4A comes to mind for that, but we are not in the business of writing grants for cities or securing implementation funds for cities. We have helped cities with raising money for the work that supports that implementation that we often oversee. So work like building that broad and diverse coalition, resourcing that coalition to bring in stakeholder groups, doing an ad campaign, a messaging campaign that kind of messages and engages people around the goal that the city has set. Resourcing like city transportation departments with the extra assistance they might need in order to do design and implementation work in terms of like that technical assistance. But we don't profess to or do the fundraising for the actual implementation costs of the infrastructure. But we can help with some of the other components. Looking through here, there was another question, Kyle, about not that challenges to updating plans because they are not authentically engaging with the most impacted communities. And I think Sarah might have just answered that one live, but I think we can speak to the importance of authentically engaging with folks of a broad diversity of the community groups that are present in a community to make sure that those voices are heard.
Yeah, one of the requirements for the grant program is a joint partnership between, a government agency and a community-based partner. And we're really intentional about that involvement of the community-based partner, because the only way for us all to move together faster, to get past the pain points of why we're actually stuck with delivering projects, is because we have to diversify the base of support that exists within the cities for this actual work. Specifically thinking about, the reason, should a city be engaged in reaching out to low-income communities of color? The answer is 100% yes. But if a city is struggling to do that, it also means they're struggling to do community engagement, just period. Like there is for cities a tell, like if they're struggling to engage communities that are most impacted by traffic violence or most impacted by the disparities that exist within our communities, it's not because they're doing great community engagement in some parts of the city and bad community engagements in others. It's that they've actually set their sights too low on the outcomes for community engagement. And so what the AMP attempts to do by bringing these partners together at the very first get-go, as a part of developing this process, is helping the city and the community partners to agree on the vision for where we're actually going, and draft the strategy for engagement, draft the strategy for project delivery, draft the strategy for resourcing local nonprofits and local organizations to be a part of that work in really effective ways, as a joint task together, instead of assuming that the city is actually going to be doing it on its own. And I find this has been my experience of working with cities, is that cities are actually really full of good intent from the people that are actually working there, but breaking the cycle, the pattern of behavior that's been established through the systems of governance, the way our funding streams work, the way local bureaucracies sort of form, is really hard to overcome that. As a new employee, you get brought into a system that already exists. Changing it is met with resistance, and so there's a lot of really good intentioned people who want to do things different, but getting unstuck is really a challenge. So the AMP's an opportunity to sort of stop that cycle and begin to have a new conversation about moving forward, and centering the partnership with local community-based organizations as a part of building trust and accountability amongst the people involved.
That is all the questions that I see. It's a great selection. Thanks, y'all, for participating. We'll give you one last minute to pop any in that you want to ask, but I will just end by saying that we will follow up with this to all the registrants with a recording so you can share this webinar with others, also with links to our website where the application lives and where other FAQs live. And again, you are always welcome to set up a one-on-one with any of us so we can talk through the nuances present in your city and how we might be able to help you move forward. So thank you so much for joining, and hope you all have a great day.